Okay, welcome back. In this segment, we're going to be talking about personal responses. What influences our attitudes? Broadly speaking, we include things like what kind of advice or feedback did you get from your parents, from your friends? We also have impact for ourselves. What's your own appearance? How do you look? How do you present yourself? Do people respond based upon your appearance? Our attitudes are influenced by whether we have a disability or we know someone. Certainly, it's been my experience that if you have a disability or know someone, you're much more attuned to many of these issues that we're talking about. If disability is a fairly new area for you, this is new information, and particularly the idea of disability as a social issue or as a civil rights issue is a new concept for many. When we think about our attitudes and development, who have we met, who have we talked to, and in what ways? If I've, as a service provider, if I've only worked with people with disabilities where I'm the expert and I'm helping them, that gives me a very different perspective on things than if I'm working with somebody who has a disability who is my peer or in fact my boss, because now we're interacting at a different level. And so the more we can interact with people at the same level and in a collaborative fashion, the greater the likelihood that we'll have a positive impact on attitudes. When we think about people's personal responses to disability, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is appearance. And we're not going to go into a long discussion about attractiveness. There's a large literature on that. There's some resources or links in your study materials for this, but more talking about appearance from the standpoint of unexpectedness, our differentness, if you will. Because really, as we go along our daily life, we tend to expect that people will behave, walk, look in a certain manner. And it's that unexpectedness that throws us. Even as something as simple as if, Sarah, one of our guest speakers who's blind, uses a cane versus a dog. I'd like to show you a quick clip from her about how even something as simple or as different as whether you have a cane versus a dog makes a difference in how people respond to you, just based on appearance.
I would say, for me personally, using a cane deters people from wanting to interact with me. I don't know why that is, but having a dog for me is an easier way to travel because a dog will help you avoid the obstacle instead of you hitting the obstacle first and then finding your way around it. And I've also noticed that the dog is a very good icebreaker. People will oftentimes talk to my dog, which is not allowed, obviously, but that's something that we can talk about and connect with, because everyone has a soft spot for a dog.
So thank you, Sarah. And as we come back, what we see on that is certainly, think about it. If she has the cane, she's seen as much more unique and much more different than if she has the dog, and yet she hasn't changed at all. It's simply external appearance. And when I mention that, I think it's important to note because we are hardwired to notice differences, right? And I take some of this work from Miller and Salmon's book they had in 1999 called Everybody's Different, but they made a point that I really like, and the point is this, that we can't help but notice differences, right? We expect people to have 2 arms, 2 legs. We expect people to walk. We expect people to communicate in a typical fashion. We expect them to be able to see and hear. That all those are normal expectations, and when those expectations are violated, when someone doesn't walk or doesn't see or whatever it might be, it invokes in us this kind of a primal, kind of a primitive response of what to do, right? It's our primitive brain, if you will. It kind of responds without conscious thought. And the point I would make on this is that's okay, that we can't stop that primitive response. What we can do, however, is not let it dictate how we ultimately behave. Because if I see something that is kind of disturbing or unusual for me, I can decide to notice it and ignore it, or I can decide to notice it, process it, and say, wait, this is similar to things I've dealt with in the past. I can do this and take the responsibility myself to go out and make that gesture, to say hello, to be inclusive. But recognize that there is that conflict that does exist, that we can't help but notice certain things. It's how we process it that makes us hopefully do the right thing. The other thing I would mention on this too is the idea of not only we're wired to notice differences, but we're also, some of the disabilities have different what we call stigma. Think about somebody who comes back with an amputation versus somebody who has advanced HIV or who has a substance abuse problem. Are all three of those individuals viewed similarly? They're not. We tend to, again, place judgments on one disability. If it was your fault, then, or seen as your fault, greater blame, greater stigma. Not your fault, less stigma, more acceptance. Now, certainly, as we think about disability, there's a concept that is really, really critical for us to kind of wrap our heads around, and that's the idea of insider versus outsider perspectives on things. When we talk about an insider, we're talking about, say, ourselves, our members of our own family, our own culture, depending upon the level of analysis. But we're talking about people who have a shared experience. Okay? When we talk about people who are deaf, for example, I have a brother that's deaf. I sign fluently. I've worked in the field for many, many years. But I'm not an insider because I hear. So I'm close. I understand a lot of things, but I don't yet have that experience. Insiders, and again, when we talk about language use, can use whatever language they want with one another. That's a choice. We talk about language use from an outsider perspective because we want to be respectful at all times. When we think about insiders versus outsiders, one of the things we also know, and if you want to get formal about this, it's referred to as the fundamental attribution error, but it's that idea that as individuals, we think our behavior is, and know that our behavior is largely influenced by the environment. When other people, however, look at us, what they tend to do is make judgments about our behavior and assume that our behavior is just a trait. So if I'm, for example, 5 minutes late to my first meeting with you, how do you think of that? Is it that I'm somebody who's late all the time, that I'm a procrastinator, that I don't prepare well? Or from my standpoint, did I have to wait extra time for the bus to come and pick up my son, and then I got stuck by a train, and despite my best efforts, geez, all these things happen. Yeah, I am 5 minutes late. I'm sorry. For me, it's experience. It's my environment. From the other person's standpoint, oftentimes looked at as, oh, well, that's just who he is. You can imagine how that then plays for people with disabilities, that we assume that their disability is the cause for a lot of what happens with them, when in fact, from their standpoint, this is just life. Now, I do, as we talk about this insider versus outsider perspective, have a really good quote that I'd like to share with you from a poet named Mark O'Brien, and I think he summarizes things very well. There's a link to a video that he produced. And what he says is that, and again, think about this because he's very severely disabled in his video as well as in this image you see. He's in an iron lung. But what he says is this: disability causes me to believe more strongly in a duality between body and spirit because I don't want to be this body. I want to be the soul. From Mark O'Brien, a poet. Okay, within this segment, we focused on influences on our attitudes in terms of the broad things, in terms of family, parents, experiences. But we also mentioned issues of, how one looks, that we mentioned you can't really help but notice differences. And that's again, I'll remind you within our segment here, noticing difference we can't help. How we process that, how we respond to it, that's very significant. Talked a little bit about stigma and how certainly some disabilities have greater shame, greater concern, greater judgment, if you will, on them versus others, and that can certainly make a difference as far as people disclosing or otherwise sharing. And then our final part in this segment talked about the insider-outsider perspective, that as relates to disability, if you're that person with a disability, you're the insider. The rest of us are outsiders, and so what's best. As outsiders, we have only the general knowledge and what you share with us. So with that, we'll move on to our next segment. And in our next segment, we're going to talk about the idea of creating attitude change.